All right, it's a few minutes after 3, so we'll go ahead and get started. First off, I want to wish everybody a happy Earth Day. I want to thank you for attending today's webinar in celebration of Earth Day. I know we can't do some of the things that we normally do this time of year, but I think you're going to be well satisfied with today's guest speaker. And on that note, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. It's Dr. Jessica Oster. And I want to thank her as well for being willing to provide her webinar for us. Dr. Oster, just to kind of introduce her, is an associate professor in the Earth and Environmental Sciences Department at Vanderbilt University. She works in the area of paleoclimatology, and I'll let her get into that a little bit more in a few minutes with her presentation. She leads the Earth Horizons project along with Dr. Deatra Young here at TSU, and this project focuses on some teaching and research collaborations with undergraduate students at TSU to help increase minority representation in the geosciences. She's also interested in extension and has collaborated with me in doing some trainings for extension agents related to helping farmers with our changing climate. Her presentation is for today is entitled Current and Future Climate Change in Tennessee, What We Know and How We Know It. And this was actually used in the training that I mentioned before. She was able to collect some information from the extension agents that attended and find out some of the changes that they were actually seeing out in the field too. So hopefully she'll be able to share some of those insights today as well. So without taking up any more time, I'd just like to turn things over to Dr. Oster and leave the rest of the time to her. One note, before we get started though, I'm gonna go ahead and mute everybody. If you're not already muted, if you don't mind muting yourself, that way we'll prevent any sort of feedback or noise that might cause issues. And then we'll open things back up at the end of the talk for any questions that you might have. All right, so Dr. Oster, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to Dr. Dukoff. I'm excited to be able to talk to you guys today. I've had some great interactions with folks over at TSU over the past few years, the Earth Horizons program, which you just mentioned, and then also possibly some of you have seen some of the students from my geochemistry class that I teach over at Vanderbilt. The cover image that you see for my presentation is a picture of students in that class doing fieldwork on the research farm last fall. So maybe that view is familiar to many of you. And like Dr. Dukoff said also, this presentation was one that I put together as part of these extension agent trainings on climate change. So these days began with Dr. Dukoff giving a bit of an introduction about a survey that he has done to look into what extension agents in Tennessee know and what they think about climate change. And then I gave this presentation, and then this was followed up by several people from TSU and from UT who gave a series of talks focused on very practical matters in terms of agriculture and climate change, thinking about corn production, cotton production, use of pesticides. So this was just a small part of a much longer day where there was a lot of great information. We did this once in West Tennessee and once in Middle Tennessee. So I just want to stress that the audience that this was intended for is ag extension agents, to kind of give them a picture of what we know about climate change in Tennessee. But I'm happy to be able to give it to you guys today. All right, so let's get started. So I began by giving a bit of an introduction to me and who I am, which is, I'm very new to thinking about extension, and I am not an agricultural scientist. I'm a paleoclimatologist and I'm a geologist. So some of what I do probably seemed kind of out there, but most of my research is actually focused on cave environments, which actually might not be so strange to some of you at TSU, because there's a lot of great cave research that happens over there. But what I do is I look at paleoclimate records from caves. And so what you see on the screen are just some pictures of me and my students and collaborators over time, different caves in Wyoming and in Tennessee and in California, where we go into caves, we collect cave deposits, things like stalagmites, and we bring them back to the lab and we cut them open and we drill them and we can date them and we can use the information about their chemistry to reconstruct what climate was like in the past over the cave in which those stalagmites grew. So, so I produce a lot of wiggly lines like what you see over here that tell us something about what climate was like in the past. So I just say this to give you an idea of the background that I have and the perspective that I bring to thinking about climate change and at what's happening today and what we might expect for the future. So I have a very long-term perspective on climate change. So after that, I sort of began by asking the agents what they have observed. And you know, I really viewed these training events as a chance for me to listen and to hear a lot about what people are seeing so that I could start to learn more about, you know, what kind of information needs to be out there. So I had them stop and think about these 3 questions. What have you observed about climate in your part of Tennessee over time, recently, or over your lifetime? Have you observed changes in temperature, changes in rainfall, changes in the timing of seasons or different events, things like floods, droughts, or fires, or anything else they could think of? Have the farmers they've been working with mentioned anything that they have observed? And what are they being asked about climate change by the farmers? So I did kind of a classic teacher kind of thing and had them sit and think for a moment. And then turn to their neighbor and discuss it. And then we had a nice conversation. And so, you know, I encourage you to think about this. I'm not going to try to run that kind of interaction over Zoom right now, but I do want to share with you some of the things that the agents said in these discussions. And then, you know, perhaps at the end of this, you know, you can let me know what you have observed or what your thoughts are based on what they said. So here are some of the things that really stood out to me, and we saw kind of similar, you know, observations in both West and Middle Tennessee. So people have noticed more variability in weather patterns, including more extremes, so more extreme temperatures, more extreme precipitation, especially more flooding. In particular, a later onset of frost, and people discussed maybe the compression or the shifting of the winter season. You know, maybe we see frost onsetting a bit later in the year and winter really happening maybe more in, you know, starting more in January or February. In terms of what the farmers are observing and what they're saying, the agents pointed out that the farmers feel like they have narrower windows for action in terms of planting, harvesting, maybe applying pesticides. So they have to make quick decisions about what they're going to do based on the climate and the weather that's happening. Farmers are curious if they should buy more equipment and what investments they should make on their farms. And then agents wonder what we need to do to educate them. So these are just some of the things that came up during these conversations, which were really, really productive. Okay, so here is some language that comes from the National Climate Assessment. And I'm just going to read this out loud to you, although I know you're perfectly capable of reading yourselves. But temperature, precipitation, and other day-to-day weather conditions are influenced by a range of factors, from fixed local conditions, things like topography, you know, whether you're in an urban or a rural environment, to cyclical and chaotic patterns of natural variability within the climate system, things like El Nino, which you might have heard of. Over short time scales and smaller geographic regions, the influence of natural variability can be larger than the influence of human activity. But when we start to think over longer time scales and over larger geographic regions, the human influence can dominate. Okay, so What I'm going to try to do now is go to a different, is show you an interactive animation. Let's see. I'm going to do a new screen share and show you this. Hopefully you can see this. So this is an animation. This is part of the National Climate Assessment that came out in 2018. And I'm really happy I can show you this animation. It didn't work at any of the events. But so what you see here on the x-axis is time, and on the y-axis is temperature difference from average. So 0 would be no different from average, and the average is going to be the, the late part of the 1800s, and then the first part of the 1900s. So the black line you see is the observed temperature difference. So you can see, we're close to average, and then we start to go up, especially in the second half of the 20th century. And superimposed on this long-term trend, you see all of these little wiggles. So then what you can do with this animation is you can take a look at both the natural and the human drivers of climate variability. So we can start by looking at the natural drivers. So something like volcanic activity. Okay, so yay, we can click and it comes on. So this green line now is telling us something about the contribution of volcanic activity to temperature. And what you can see here is that there are some instances where we've had big volcanic eruptions. They contribute to a decrease in global temperature because they put aerosols into the atmosphere. So some of these wiggles, can definitely be explained by volcanic activity, but we don't really see the long-term trend. We can turn on solar. Solar variability is something that we see changing on roughly 11-year time, 11-year periods with the sunspot cycle. So there's some wiggliness, but not really an overall shift. And then we can turn on orbital variation, and that is a much longer term driver that changes the way that Earth's orbit is shaped and the way Earth moves around the sun. This is something that acts on timescales that I'm used to thinking about, things in the tens to hundreds of thousands of year timescales that drive ice ages happening. But in terms of our record here and the timescales that we're looking at, we don't really see a significant long-term trend. Okay, so those are the natural drivers, and we can click on all natural drivers and we can sort of click off each of these individually. So now we see the composite of all of the natural drivers. And then we can start to add the human drivers. We can look at things like aerosols, which will tend to, contribute to global cooling. We can look at changes in land cover and ozone. And none of these so far have really helped us get this long-term upward trend that we start to see until we get to greenhouse gases. And so here with greenhouse gases, we see, okay, here, this can account for this long-term warming that we see in the overall record. So then we can click on human drivers, we can click off all of these individual things, and we can see that summed together, the long-term trend is really best explained when we incorporate human drivers. So then we can add all of the drivers, and we can see, yeah, there's some influence of these things like volcanic eruptions. There's probably some influence of these things like solar activity. But to get the full picture, we really need to incorporate the human drivers, and in particular, the greenhouse gas forcing. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to my presentation. Hopefully this works. All right, so here we are. And then this is a summary figure that kind of shows all of that. So you can see, all natural influences, all human influences, and then all of them together. So we can really see, to explain long-term changes, we must invoke the human drivers. All right, so for most of this presentation, what I'm going to be doing is showing you information from the 4th National Climate Assessment. This is something, the URL is down here. This is something you can go and read. There's tons of information here. It came out in 2018. That animation I just showed you came from that. And it's really meant to sort of think about all of the US, all of the impacts, risks associated with climate change, everything that we're seeing. And it incorporates lots of different indicators that have variable importance in different places. So, you know, in places where you have snowpacks like the Western US that are really dependent on snowpacks for storing water and providing water throughout the summer, you know, they look at that indicator. For things like places like Hawaii, right? Ocean acidity is very important. For us in Tennessee, you know, things like growing season length, drought, heat waves, temperature, heavy precipitation, all of these are going to be the most important indicators for us here in our region. So there's a chapter devoted to the Southeast, chapter 19, if you're interested in looking. And this, you know, the things that we have to look at in Tennessee are things like what I just mentioned: extreme heat events, heavy precipitation, decreased water availability, and also flooding and wildfire. Okay, so now we can start to take a look at some of the results that the report shows in terms of what we have seen in Tennessee and in the Southeast region. And so here we've got on the top number of hot days and then number of warm nights on the bottom. So here we've got it averaged out decadally, and then we've got percent change for the second half of the 20th century and the first half of this century relative to the first half of the 20th century. And so, you know, here I asked the agents what they noticed. And I think, you know, what stands out pretty clearly here is that the real change that we're seeing is not in the number of hot days, but in the number of warm nights. So we really see a steady increase over the last 4 decades in the number of nights with a temperature above 75 degrees. When you look at a percent change, you know, across the Southeast, this is a very stark change. So we're really seeing an increase in the number of warm nights, and this drives our overall average daily temperature increase as well. So average summer temperatures have increased during the most recent 10 years. They've been the warmest on record, with very large increases in nighttime temperature, more modest increases in daytime temperature. There are lots of impacts by the lack of nighttime cooling on agriculture. And I asked the agents to sort of brainstorm some of these, and there was lots out there: stress on livestock, an increase in transpiration that might happen with warmer nights, some changes to the effectiveness of different herbicides and pesticides. 61% of southeastern cities are also experiencing worsening heat waves, and a higher percentage is happening in our region than in any other region in the country. And we also see a change in the length of the freeze-free season. And this is something that the agents came up with from their own observations as well. So the freeze-free season length is getting longer. So in the last 3 decades, we see a steady increase in the number of days per year, the difference from average. And here's the percent change over here. So we're seeing the length of the freeze-free season increase throughout the Southeast, including in Tennessee. We're seeing more extreme precipitation events. And up here, I just have a little thumbnail from the Nashville flood in 2010. But we see increased frequency in most places across Tennessee. Exceptions include parts of Appalachia and the edge of the Cumberland Plateau, where you see some blue dots. But really, we're seeing this over here is days with precipitation above 3 inches. So lots more in the last 30 years, especially these extreme precipitation events. Another concern is the habitability for certain mosquitoes. The current suitability for the Aedes aegypti mosquito, which carries diseases in July in 50 different cities. So you can see here in Nashville, we have a moderate to high potential abundance of these. The Southeast region is the region of the country with the greatest potential for mosquito activity, greatest potential for an increase in mosquito activity with warming temperatures. I also showed the agents this, and this is something that some of you may be familiar with. This is an online data product that you can interact with from the USA National Phenology Network. You can look at changes in the timing of spring leaf out. So this is just a screenshot, and so you can go and play with this data too. This is for March 1st of last year and for the red maple. And you can see that the leaf out of the red maple across Tennessee was happening, up to 20 days earlier than average across much of the Southeast. This was in 2018, and I went back for this year, 2019, and this is 2020. So you can see the same thing, earlier than average leaf out for red maples across much of the Southeast. And there's lots of data here. I encourage you to take a look at it. You can look at lots of different species. You can visualize the data in different ways. So plants are leafing out sooner. And I also wanted to emphasize to them and to you guys that just because, temperatures are warming overall, it doesn't mean that we don't have cold temperatures sometimes. Since much of my research happens out west, I'm very interested in these broad scale synoptic patterns that happen in terms of, continent scale weather. And we see these cold breaks happen in Tennessee, in particular, when we have this pattern across the continent where we have high pressure, warm temperatures in the west and cold temperatures in the east, this dipole. And this warm west, cold east pattern is becoming more common. I encourage you guys to take a look at this Weather West blog and follow this guy on Twitter because he has a lot of great information about climate and wildfire and things in the West that also pertain to us when you think about broad continent scale patterns. Okay, most of the differences between present and future climates will be determined by choices that society makes today. So from here, I wanted to talk about the predictions that are laid out in this assessment and how those predictions are made. So I began by discussing different scenarios and how these scenarios are modeled by different global climate models or general circulation models. So in order to make predictions for the future, we work with different scenarios called representative concentration pathways, or RCPs. And this is a greenhouse gas concentration trajectory. And there are different scenarios that are based on different, choices that we as a society might make. So you'll see the high emissions scenario called RCP 8.5, and that's shown in red. In this scenario, emissions continue to rise through the 21st century. You might hear it called business as usual, and it's the trajectory that we're currently on. So it's basically the high emissions scenario. And by emissions, I'm talking about greenhouse gases. You'll also see the lower emission scenario, RCP 4.5, where we have emissions peaking around 2040 and then declining. So that's our blue line here. So we peak around 2040 and then start to go down. And then we also have an even lower scenario that I'm not really going to talk about, but that you see on this graph. And then here you have observed changes in black. So you can already kind of see we are on the 8.5 line. So what happens is people take those scenarios, and there are climate modeling groups all over the world that use those scenarios to model what might happen with Earth's climate. And they use these things called GCMs, general circulation models. There are many countries that run these models. In the US, we have one that's run through NCAR in Colorado. And they divide the Earth up into a series of boxes along the Earth's surface and up into the atmosphere, and they look at the oceans as well. So they couple changes in the Earth and the ocean, in sea ice, in continental ice. They have mathematical equations that describe the materials in each of the cells and how energy moves through these cells. Results from each grid cell are passed to neighboring cells, and then the equations are solved again. So Scientists will specify the climate forcings acting in the model. And so they'll take these different RCPs and model what will happen into the future under these different scenarios. And because all of these models are set up in slightly different ways, we get slightly different results. And then what the groups like the IPCC do is they take all of those results and they use the whole, all of that information to make predictions. So what you see over here is each of these lines represents a different simulation. So what temperature change do models simulate? The red are the RCP 8.5s, the yellow are the RCP 4.5s, and then you have some scenarios in between that. So you can see we have global mean temperature anomalies. You know, there's difference, but on the whole, the red lines are higher. You know, the yellow lines are lower. So there's a range of variability predicted by these models. Okay, so here we can see the observed changes in temperature and then some predictions from these different scenarios and all of these climate models together. So we've got observed changes for 1986 to 2016 relative to 1906 to 1960. So I was showing you some of this earlier for the Southeast, but here you see the whole country. In Tennessee, we're pink, so we're, you know, a little bit warmer in terms of overall average change. Then you can start to look at predictions. We've got the lower emissions scenario and the higher emissions scenario for the middle of the 21st century and the late 21st century. So you can see overall, you know, both time scales, both scenarios, we're looking at warmer temperatures relative to the present. So now we're projections relative to 1986 to 2015. So in Tennessee, we're looking warmer and much, much warmer in the higher emissions scenario. We can sort of drill down to our region. So here we've got number of nights. So now we're looking at that nighttime temperature, minimum temperature greater than 75 degrees. So in the high emission scenario, we see quite a large change. This is early or mid 21st century, late 21st century. We still see changes in the lower emission scenario. And these changes are especially pronounced in West Tennessee, but we see them across Tennessee. We can look at changes in precipitation as well. So here we've got observed changes in annual precipitation for 1986 to 2015 relative to the first part of the 20th century. So in Tennessee, we can see in general an increase in precipitation, especially in West Tennessee. Then we can start to look at projections. And precipitation is a challenging thing to model. But we see projected changes in seasonal precipitation under high emissions here. And I showed you just high emissions so I can show you how it breaks out seasonally. So we've got winter, spring, summer, and fall. Red dots show areas with very large changes. Hatch marks show areas with small or insignificant changes that the models don't resolve very well. So in Tennessee, you can see, you know, we're in the hatch marked area for summer and fall. But in winter and spring, we see, you know, significant observable changes. They're just not as large as in the northern part of the US, but we see increases in winter and spring precipitation under the high emission scenario for the late 21st century. We can look at extreme precipitation. So here what you've got are the observed change in total annual precipitation that falls in the heaviest 1% of events. So here we've got the difference between, this is the sort of present change that we've been looking at, difference between the early part of the 20th century and the late part of the 20th century, early 21st. And so we see an increase of about 18% in these extreme precipitation events in our Southeast region. And then if you go down to projections, projected change in the low emission scenario and the high emission scenario, we do see a large projected change. And this is especially pronounced in the high emission scenario in East Tennessee, but really we observe it across Tennessee. So we are expecting to see more extreme precipitation as a result of climate change. Okay, so climate change risk to agriculture and forestry. So there's a whole section of the report on this, and so I would encourage you guys to take a look at it. Overall negative impact to agriculture is expected, but there might be some benefits. There are some crops that could become newly viable alternatives. There are some things you might be able to grow that you couldn't grow before. Increases in temperature, freeze-free days, water stress, drought, fire, and invasive species. Higher temperatures could decrease productivity of cotton, corn, soybeans, and rice. There's the heat stress vulnerability for livestock. There's heat stress vulnerability for the people working on farms. And then they also point out that there's going to be a change in plants that are foraged. Plants collected from the wild could become less abundant. And an example given in the report are ramps, which you can find in the Appalachians. So potentially an impact in Tennessee. They point out that our growth zone is expected to change. So historically, we are in zone 6A, 7B, and 7A. Projected by the end of the century, we're expected to be in zone 7A, 7B, 8A, and 8B. So our plant hardiness zone is projected to change. Tennessee is projected to see some of the largest changes in the region in terms of plant hardiness zone. There's also a number of compounding effects. So, I alluded to some of this, but, in addition to what we might see with crops and with livestock, this is going to affect people. So there's going to be a stress on farm workers. The report points out that, people in high-risk industries might be working less under a global warming scenario, and agriculture is part of that. Forestry, fishing, mining, construction, et cetera, are also these high-risk industries. So this is changes in the percent and changes in hours worked by percent. You can see lots of Tennessee falls in this kind of 3 to 4% area, with the change being larger in West Tennessee, where the temperature changes are projected to be larger. There's an observed change in heating and cooling degree days. So this is a measure used by the National Weather Service to track energy usage. It's the difference between average outside temperature and 65 degrees. And so this is supposed to be, a measure of, will people need to turn on their AC? Will people need to turn on their heat? This number can be added up over a month or a year to estimate the need for heating or cooling. So what we see, cooling degree days are going up, have been going up. Heating degree days have been going down. So we have to turn on our AC more. This, increases energy usage, and it's an added cost for people as well, because they have to pay for that. So they also show this is change in cooling degree days, and then superimposed on top of it are metro and non-metro areas with persistent poverty. So you can see where, where this is going to cause extra financial stress on people as well. Okay, so now we get into sort of some of what my specialty is, and this is, I keep this very brief because really, farmers and interested in the now and the future, but I also want to sort of put this in some context in terms of what we know about the Earth. So we know the climate of the last 250 years or so from historical records, from weather stations and from written records. So this is a plot that shows a number of these different temperature records, reconstructions, and oops, excuse me. Oh no, I need to go back. There we go. And so there are a number of these different groups that have compiled temperature change or temperatures on Earth over time. And I like this particular image because it's produced by the Berkeley Earth Group. And the history behind this group is that it's led by a scientist who originally was very skeptical about anthropogenic climate change. He even published an op-ed in the New York Times, which I'll get to in a second. But he was concerned that that a number of the different temperature compilations were possibly using data from urban sites that were subjected to urban warming that maybe included data from faulty sites, and he was just kind of skeptical about it. So what he did was he set about putting together his own record of temperature change. He excluded urban sites, used sites from rural stations that didn't have heat island effects. He took a number of measures to kind of subtract human bias out of it by having a computer algorithm select sites. He removed spurious sites, and he came up with the black line that you see. And so what this shows is that, many of these compilations of global temperature show the same thing. So even when you subtract out urban sites, even when you're very careful with your data, you still see this increase in temperature that happens over the last part of the 20th century and into the 21st. So, from these kinds of records, we really get a picture of the last 250 years or so of global climate and temperature. Where what I do comes in is that we start to try to look further back in the past and figure out how to do that. So just to kind of lay that out for you, here you see the historical temperature. So this is the curve that I just showed you in black, and then all of these different projections. So we've got our RCP 8.5, our RCP 4.5, and then this is, so here we have our recent past and our near future. As we go further back in time, we can't use written records anymore. So we have to look to other mechanisms to try to understand Earth's climate. And we use different kinds of what we call proxy records, things that stand in for a written measurement. And so in the somewhat recent past, we use things like ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica. If you can look at the chemistry of the ice, and it gives you an idea of temperature. So the green lines that you see here and the turquoise lines, we've got Greenland and Antarctic ice cores. And the historic average is still this dotted line here. So you can see over the last 300,000 years, for the most part, we were in ice ages. We were below historical averages, except for a few interesting time periods in the past. We can go even further back in time when there is no longer ice at the poles, and then we have to look to other things. And in particular, scientists use the chemistry of marine shelly organisms. So we'll take cores through the ocean floor, we'll look at ocean floor sediments, and we'll get a sense of ocean temperatures in that way, which are in the deep ocean are a good stand-in for global temperature. And so as you look at this, and I will point out, our temperature scale is changing. So back here, we're at 300,000 years. Now we're into millions of years. So over the last several million years, and here is still our historical average, we don't really get to regularly above the historical average until the mid-Pliocene. And if you go further back in time, we have to go very far back in time to the Eocene when we start to see temperatures like what we're projecting with our high emissions scenario. So, I say this to point out that, yes, the Earth has seen these kinds of temperatures before, but they came at a time when humans were not around and when the Earth looked very different. For example, if you see, this is when we had northern and southern hemisphere ice sheets. So at this, temperature range, we don't have ice in Greenland. As we get further back, we don't have ice in Antarctica. So that has an impact on sea level. There's lots of different things that are going to change. So yes, the Earth has been here before, but it was a much different looking Earth than the one that we know. Okay, so I ended it by asking the agents what they wanted to know more about. And so I guess I will end this by asking you what you would like to talk about. And hopefully I can unshare my screen and maybe we have time for a conversation.